The night began with a subtle weight in David Miller's chest, one he couldn't shake even as he adjusted the cuff of his shirt in front of the bathroom mirror. Vanessa had been pushing him for weeks to attend her company's annual gala, insisting that it would be good for them, good for their social image, and, most importantly, good for their marriage. She had rehearsed the words carefully, her voice practiced, polished, with a tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. David stared at his reflection, his rough, calloused hands adjusting the knot in his tie. He was a simple man, a contractor who had spent years building his life with his own hands. No, he wasn't rolling in money and he didn't have designer suits or flashy cars, but he was proud of what he'd built, a home, a life, and a marriage that he thought was grounded in love. Lately though, that foundation felt like it was slowly cracking. Vanessa's dress, a glittering emerald green gown, hung perfectly on her, catching the light from the overhead bulbs. She looked radiant, elegant, and confident. David couldn't help but admire her. For a brief second, he remembered why he had fallen in love with her, but the memory was fleeting, swallowed immediately by the pang of unease. Vanessa's eyes, which once had shone with warmth for him, now flickered like she was searching for something or someone else. The ride to the hotel was quiet. Vanessa chatted intermittently about her colleagues, the expected VIPs, and the fabulous decorations that awaited them, but David could feel the tension in her tone. Every so often, her hand would brush his, but the contact felt obligatory, not affectionate. David told himself he was overthinking, that perhaps the stress of preparing for the gala had made her distracted. Still, the nagging feeling in his gut persisted. When they arrived at the Grand Hotel ballroom, David felt a mixture of awe and discomfort. The room sparkled with crystal chandeliers, golden drapery, and tables set with fine china. Soft laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air. Guests moved gracefully through the space, their polished appearances highlighting the stark contrast to David's simple attire. He felt, for the first time that evening, painfully out of place. Vanessa's hand linked with his as they entered, a gesture that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. David smiled politely at a few familiar faces, nodded at colleagues, and forced himself to remain composed. Then he saw him, Richard Harper, the wealthy CEO of Vanessa's company, a man whose presence filled the room even without a word. His tailored suit, confident stance, and easy charm commanded attention in a way that David couldn't compete with. And Vanessa didn't just notice him. Her hand slipped from David's arm as though he didn't exist. Her eyes lit up in a way that made David's stomach churn. She walked toward Richard with a smile that was almost predatory, one that belonged to someone who had been waiting for this moment. David followed her silently, feeling invisible, like a shadow that didn't belong in the sparkling room. Vanessa laughed at something Richard said, a high, melodic sound that twisted in David's chest. She leaned in, her body angled toward Richard, her posture relaxed and intimate. David felt a sudden, cold clarity. She was no longer present with him. She hadn't been for months. As he stood by the edge of the dance floor, sipping his drink and pretending to be amused by polite conversations he didn't fully engage in, David's mind wandered back over the past year. Vanessa had changed, slowly but unmistakably. Her phone had become her constant companion, her eyes often glued to the screen instead of to him. Conversations about shared dreams or plans for the future had dwindled. She spoke often of Richard not casually, not just as a boss, but with an admiration that made David uncomfortable. A small, gnawing doubt that he had buried deep began to resurface. He watched Vanessa and Richard move across the room, their laughter mingling, their eyes locking in shared amusement. Every gesture, every glance, was a reminder of the distance that had grown between them. He tried to tell himself that he was imagining it, that maybe she was just excited to see her boss, that their interaction was purely professional. But the feeling in his gut screamed otherwise. David moved to the bar, ordering a single glass of whiskey, needing something to steady his nerves. He found himself observing other couples, their hands intertwined, their laughter genuine, and a bitter twist of envy curled in his stomach. He remembered the early days with Vanessa, how they had met at a small cafe, how she had laughed at his corny jokes, how they had promised each other a lifetime of honesty and care. The contrast was unbearable. As the night progressed, Vanessa continued to flip between Richard and the other guests, her attention focused elsewhere, while David navigated the room like an invisible spectator. A colleague patted him on the back, congratulating him on standing by his wife in such high society, and David forced a polite smile, though inside he felt hollow. By the time the gala ended, David had seen enough. He walked beside Vanessa to the car in silence, his mind racing. Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder, but it felt distant, perfunctory, a token gesture rather than a connection. The drive home was quiet. Neither spoke, and David's thoughts were heavy with the realization that the woman he had loved might no longer see him as the man she wanted. When they arrived home, David lingered in the foyer, watching Vanessa slip out of her heels and set her clutch on the counter. She glanced at him briefly, a smile playing on her lips, but it lacked the warmth he remembered. He knew, in that moment, that something fundamental had shifted. The night, meant to be a celebration of elegance, success, and shared life, had become a silent unveiling of a truth David had been too afraid to acknowledge. Vanessa was changing, and he might already be losing her. David walked to the bedroom, leaving her in the living room, and closed the door softly behind him. Alone, he sank onto the bed, letting the weight of the evening settle over him. The gala had been a window into her world, a world that no longer seemed to include him in the way he thought it should. The sharp nod in his chest that had accompanied the evening had transformed into something heavier, a warning, a premonition, the whisper of betrayal yet to come. He stared at the ceiling, silent, and wondered how long he had been blind to it. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the hardest nights were still ahead. The days after the gala felt heavier than any work week David had endured. The memory of Vanessa's hand slipping from his arm at the hotel, the way her eyes had lingered on Richard, replayed relentlessly in his mind. He told himself it was paranoia at first. After all, Richard Harper was charismatic, successful, and confident, a man who commanded attention, but the nagging ache in David's chest refused to be ignored. Vanessa, meanwhile, resumed her routine with effortless grace, as if nothing had shifted at all. She carried herself with the same elegance, her hair glossy, her wardrobe meticulously curated, and her smile perfect. But David noticed the small things, the way her phone rested in her hand more than ever, the fleeting glances at texts she'd quickly hide, and the slight tension in her posture whenever he approached. "David," she said one evening as he brought in groceries from the car, "can you pass me my purse?" Her tone was casual, almost rehearsed, but he caught the faint edge of impatience. He handed it to her, and as their fingers brushed, she withdrew hers quickly, her eyes darting back to her phone. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but to David, it was a subtle confirmation of the shift he had felt since the gala. Their conversations had changed, too. Once, they could spend hours talking about everything and nothing: weekend plans, favorite movies, dreams for the future. Now, Vanessa's words were clipped, practical, or filtered through her professional life. She spoke of meetings, corporate events, or office gossip, with Richard mentioned more often than David cared to count. Every mention was laced with admiration, sometimes veiled, sometimes not. David tried to engage, tried to show interest in her world, but every effort felt like a performance. He knew he couldn't compete with Richard's wealth, charisma, or influence over her mind. It wasn't that David lacked love or devotion, it was that he was increasingly irrelevant in a life she was building around someone else. He remembered the early days of their marriage, the nights spent talking under dim kitchen lights, laughing until their sides ached, making plans for modest vacations and home improvements. Those moments had felt like intimacy, like a bond unbreakable by circumstance. But now, they seemed like distant memories, fragile fragments of a life that had been slowly eroded by ambition, desire, and distraction. One Friday evening, David noticed her texting more frequently, laughing quietly at something on her phone while sitting across from him at dinner. "Who's that?" he asked casually, trying not to sound accusatory. Vanessa glanced up with a faint smile. "Oh, just Emily. She's telling me about her promotion." David nodded, trying to maintain composure, but the unease in his gut deepened. He watched her closely, noting how her eyes lingered on the screen, how her lips curved slightly, how her fingers tapped rhythmically. Every subtle gesture became a puzzle he couldn't solve. Later that night, David lay awake in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional hum of traffic outside. Vanessa's soft breathing beside him seemed distant, almost indifferent. He realized he hadn't felt her warmth in months, hadn't felt her presence in a way that reassured him of love. He thought about confronting her, but every time he rehearsed the words, they died in his throat. What if he was wrong? What if he was imagining things? He had no proof, only suspicion, only the gnawing, persistent feeling that she was slipping away from him. The next week, David tried to reconnect. He suggested a simple weekend outing, just the two of them, a drive to the countryside, a picnic by the lake. Vanessa, it'll be nice. Just us, some fresh air, we can talk, laugh, maybe remember why we're together, he said earnestly. She looked at him for a moment, her green eyes unreadable. I don't know, David. I've got brunch with some colleagues Saturday and Sunday. I'll probably need to catch up on emails. He nodded, hiding the frustration that tightened his chest. Okay, he said softly, forcing a smile. But inside, he felt a sharp pang of rejection. The weekend, which should have been a chance to bridge the growing gap, was already closing in on him like a door shutting. A few days later, David noticed another pattern. Vanessa's late nights at the office were becoming more frequent, her explanations more vague. Team deadlines, she said. Richard wants me to stay late. It's important for my career. David wanted to support her, truly. But the words echoed in his mind. Richard wants me to stay late. His thoughts spiraled. Did she need him at all, or was he merely a placeholder? A familiar presence she tolerated while her attention belonged elsewhere. He started observing more than participating. Every time she left the apartment, he noted the times, the excuses, the inconsistencies. At first, he told himself it was just concern, a husband caring for his wife. But slowly, the pattern became undeniable, gnawing at the walls of trust he had painstakingly built. One evening, he tried gently. Vanessa, I feel like we're drifting, he said, choosing his words with care. I miss us the way we used to be. Can we spend some time together this weekend? Just us? She paused, fingers hovering over her phone. Her face softened for a brief second, and David allowed himself a flicker of hope. I'll try, David, she said, finally not meeting his eyes, but you know how busy things are right now. The words hit him harder than he expected. She wasn't refusing outright, but the lack of enthusiasm, the absence of commitment, cut deeper than any confrontation could. David lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling again, feeling a hollow ache. He realized the cracks in their marriage were wider than he had admitted to himself. Vanessa wasn't just distracted or stressed, she was becoming someone else, someone who no longer prioritized him, someone who was slipping out of his reach. He began noticing the little betrayals, secretive phone calls, texts she quickly hid, subtle changes in her tone when speaking about Richard, the way she lingered on messages that weren't meant for him. Each one felt like a small fracture, invisible but painful, slowly eroding the foundation of trust. David didn't know how much longer he could ignore it. Every interaction, every smile that didn't reach her eyes, every laugh that was shared elsewhere pushed him closer to a realization he feared, that his wife's heart was no longer fully his. By the end of the week, David understood something vital. He could no longer live in denial. The signs were everywhere, the patterns undeniable. The distance between them was growing, and if he didn't confront it soon, the person he loved might be gone before he ever had the courage to fight for her. The cracks in the marriage were no longer subtle, they were glaring, impossible to ignore. And David knew that the next step could either save what remained of their relationship or shatter it completely. David had spent the last few weeks walking a careful line between denial and dread. Each morning, he told himself he was imagining things that Vanessa was just busy, stressed, focused on her career, but the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Late nights, whispered phone calls, and fleeting glances at her screen that she quickly hid the evidence, piled up like bricks, heavy and undeniable. He tried rationalizing it at first. Maybe she's stressed about work, maybe Richard is just a demanding boss. He repeated these thoughts to himself endlessly, as though chanting them could stave off the gnawing worry that had lodged itself in his chest. But the more he tried to reason, the more his gut twisted. Something was wrong, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. It started with a casual text from Emily, one of Vanessa's colleagues. Hey Vanessa, lunch today? Can you make it by noon? David noticed Vanessa smile at the message in a way that made his stomach sink. She replied quickly, and when David asked who it was, she said casually, Emily from work. She wants to discuss a project. But there was something in her voice, a lightness, almost amusement that didn't belong to professional correspondence. He watched her over the next few days, noting patterns. Calls late at night that ended when he entered the room. Quick glances at her phone, lips curling at messages he couldn't see. And Richard? Always Richard. Sometimes it was just a mention in conversation, sometimes a lingering look she wouldn't hide, and sometimes the casual admiration in her tone when she spoke about him. The more David observed, the more he realized he had been blind for months. What he had dismissed as stress or ambition was something else entirely. a shift in her attention, in her priorities, in her heart. One Friday, he couldn't resist following his intuition. Vanessa had told him she was attending a networking dinner downtown. He pretended to be absorbed in work, but quietly took a cab to the restaurant district, parking across the street and waiting. He told himself it was paranoia, but a part of him hoped he was wrong. Through the window, he saw her, laughing, tilting her head in a way he remembered only seeing reserved for him. But this time, she wasn't talking to him. She was talking to Richard, or rather, someone who resembled Richard in charm and presence. His heart sank as he watched her gesture animatedly, sip her wine, and lean just a little too close. David couldn't breathe. He wanted to run, to storm in, to confront her, but he stayed frozen, his hands gripping the steering wheel as his mind raced. How long has this been going on? He asked himself. Is this just admiration, or something more? At home that night, Vanessa arrived with her usual smile, soft and controlled, as if nothing had happened. Traffic was terrible, she said, shrugging off her coat, but dinner was fine. David nodded, forcing a neutral expression. Sounds nice. He wanted to ask, to demand, to tear the truth out of her, but he didn't. Instead, he waited, watched, and listened for any hint, any slip that could confirm his growing fear. The next few weeks became a slow torture. David noticed small things, subtle but persistent. Her phone would vibrate constantly, a low, insistent hum he wasn't meant to notice. Texts from Richard would appear on her lock screen, usually deleted quickly, but enough glimpses to make his heart race. She lingered on her mirror longer than usual, primping, adjusting her dress, her makeup. Every gesture was meticulous, deliberate, and increasingly performed for someone other than him. David's friends began noticing his distraction. You okay, man? His colleague Thomas asked one evening at the bar. You look off. David forced a laugh. Just tired. That's all. Thomas leaned closer. Look, I don't want to intrude, but I saw Vanessa last week downtown. She was at that rooftop lounge with a guy. Not anyone I knew, but she seemed close, you know? David felt the world tilt. He nodded slowly, fighting the impulse to grab Thomas by the collar and demand more. Thanks for telling me, he said, voice tight. That night, alone, David scoured through every subtle sign he had noticed over the past month. Every unexplained absence, every fleeting smile at a text, every admiration for Richard, now they coalesced into a picture he had tried desperately to deny. Vanessa wasn't just distracted, she was shifting her life towards someone else, someone he couldn't compete with. One rainy evening, David decided to confront reality directly. He asked Vanessa to meet him at a quiet cafe, away from home, away from distractions. David, she said, voice light. What's this about? I need to know the truth, he said, his hands gripping the table. Vanessa, are you seeing someone else? Her eyes widened for the briefest moment, a flicker of guilt, or was it surprise? Then she smiled, carefully, almost charmingly. What are you talking about? David leaned forward. I've noticed the texts, the late nights, the way you look at Richard. I'm asking you to be honest with me. Vanessa laughed softly, a sound that cut deeper than any accusation. David, I don't know what you're imagining. I've been busy, yes, but that doesn't mean… But her voice trailed off. She didn't finish, and that unfinished sentence was more damning than any confession. David left the cafe that night with a hollow ache, a mix of fear, heartbreak, and resolve. He couldn't live in this limbo any longer. He had to know, definitively, where Vanessa's heart truly lay. The suspicion had taken root, spreading like wildfire. Every day became a careful observation, every conversation a test, every gesture a clue. He began to record her patterns, keep notes in his mind, catalogue every suspicious interaction. His sleep became restless, haunted by imagined scenarios, each one more unbearable than the last. And deep down, David understood. The longer he waited, the more he risked losing the woman he loved, not just to Richard, but to the inevitability of betrayal that seemed to grow more certain with every passing day. The cracks in their marriage had widened, and now suspicion wasn't just a whisper, it was a roar, impossible to ignore. David didn't yet know the full extent of her betrayal, but he knew one thing. He would not remain blind much longer. The next confrontation, he realized, was inevitable, and when it came, nothing would ever be the same. David's heart had been pounding for days. The suspicion that had quietly gnawed at him now demanded answers. Every late-night call, Every lingering glance, every subtle smirk she directed at Richard had compounded into an unbearable certainty. He had to know. That Thursday evening, David arrived home early, pretending he had finished a minor client project ahead of schedule. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, and his chest tightened as he noticed Vanessa's purse was gone. Out again, he thought, his gut twisting. He tried to steady himself, telling himself he was overreacting, but instinct and months of small betrayals told him otherwise. He decided to follow her, to finally see the truth for himself. The restaurant district wasn't far. David parked a block away, keeping to the shadows, careful not to draw attention. Across the street, through the rain-speckled glass, he saw her, Vanessa, laughing, tilting her head, her hand brushing the arm of a man David didn't know immediately, but as she leaned closer, whispered something in his ear, and let out a soft, intimate laugh, David's stomach dropped. He recognized the man instantly from her work, Richard Harper. Time slowed. Every detail, the tilt of her head, the sparkle in her eyes, the warmth of her smile, burned into David's mind. He had suspected, observed, doubted, and hoped against hope, but the reality was far worse than he had imagined. She wasn't just distracted, she was invested. David felt frozen, both in shock and heartbreak. He wanted to storm inside, to demand answers, to scream until the world heard his betrayal. But he stayed silent, watching as the woman he had loved for years placed her heart so openly, so deliberately, into the hands of another. When Vanessa returned hours later, dripping with rain, her laughter fading into polite greetings for him, David knew he couldn't contain it any longer. "Vanessa," he said, voice low but tense. "We need to talk." She looked up, cautious but calm, her wet hair clinging to her face. "David, it's late. I'm tired." "No," he said firmly. "I need the truth. Were you with him?" Her eyes flickered, a brief flash of guilt, then she masked it with a smile. "David, what are you talking about?" "I saw you at Delano's with Richard." The words hung between them like shattered glass. Vanessa's hands froze, clutching her coat. For a moment, silence ruled, the kind of silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air out of the room. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured, almost detached. "David, you saw what you saw." "What does that mean?" he demanded, rising from the couch. "You're lying. I know you are. Why won't you just admit it?" She took a slow breath, setting her coat aside. "Because it's complicated. I didn't plan for this to happen. But David, you've been gone emotionally, mentally. You've been so consumed with work, with your projects, with everything but us. And Maynham's, the rounds, Olo." David felt rage and sorrow mix in equal measure. "So you replaced me? Is that what this is? You couldn't talk to me? You couldn't tell me how you felt? You just found someone else?" Vanessa's lips pressed tightly together. She didn't answer. The silence was confirmation enough. The confrontation escalated quickly, voices raised, accusations hurled, memories of laughter, and promises twisted into weapons. David accused her of betrayal, of destroying everything they had built. Vanessa retaliated, pointing out his absences, his obsession with work, the moments when he hadn't been emotionally available. But beneath the anger, beneath the shouting, lay the undeniable truth. Vanessa's heart had shifted. Her emotional intimacy, her admiration, her attention, it no longer centered on David. She had chosen someone else, someone who filled the void he had inadvertently left. Tears streamed down David's face as the weight of realization crushed him. The betrayal was complete, total, and irrevocable. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with had been slowly slipping away, and he hadn't been able to stop it. Hours passed. Words were said, retracted, repeated. Finally, exhausted and hollow, David sank onto the couch. Vanessa retreated to the bedroom, her movements brisk, her face composed. The apartment felt empty despite her presence. David stared at the floor, numb. The glamour, the laughter, the facade of their life together, all had crumbled. He realized that trust, once broken, leaves scars deeper than any physical wound. That night, sleep eluded him. He replayed every moment, every sign he had ignored or rationalized, every text, every lingering glance, every distant smile. The evidence had been there all along, but he had been blind. By dawn, he understood something crucial. This betrayal was not just about Vanessa, it was about him as well. He had allowed work, routine, and distraction to consume him, letting the space between them grow until it was too wide to bridge. But awareness, David realized, was the first step toward reclaiming his life. He had faced the betrayal, seen it in living color, and survived the heartbreak. The next steps would be the hardest, deciding what to do, what to forgive, and how to rebuild, or whether rebuilding was even possible. The truth had been unveiled, and now David's life would never be the same. David spent the morning after the confrontation staring at the ceiling of his bedroom. The apartment was quiet, almost eerily so. Vanessa's absence hung in the air like a heavy fog, and David felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. The betrayal had shattered more than just his trust, it had shattered the image of his life, the version of himself that believed love alone could sustain a marriage. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face, trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had overtaken him. Months of subtle betrayals, ignored signs, and half-truths had led to this moment. The revelation hadn't come in a sudden flash. It had crept in quietly, like a shadow stretching across the room until it swallowed everything familiar. The first step, he realized, was acknowledging the truth. Vanessa had chosen someone else. She had invested her attention, her affection, and perhaps her heart into Richard, leaving David with the harsh clarity that their marriage could not survive intact. It was painful, yes, but there was a strange liberation in that recognition. No more illusions, no more guessing games. The betrayal was real, and now it could no longer silently erode his life. He moved through the apartment with a strange sense of detachment, noticing details he had ignored for months: the small cracks in the walls, the scuffed coffee table, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. The home that had once been a shared sanctuary now felt like neutral ground, a space where he could start again without illusions. David's friends reached out, sensing his distress. Thomas invited him for a long drive, some time to talk and clear his mind. Over the course of the weekend, David recounted the events, his suspicions, and the confrontation. Friends offered advice, but mostly they listened. Listening, he realized, was what he had needed most: to speak the unspoken, to name the betrayal, and to let someone else hear it without judgment. He also reflected on himself, his role in the unraveling. Had he been too consumed by work? Had he ignored Vanessa's needs, her loneliness? These questions haunted him, not as guilt, but as lessons he would carry forward. He realized that love required attention, not just presence. Trust required communication, not silence. And self-respect required boundaries, even in the face of heartbreak. In the weeks that followed, David began reclaiming small pieces of his life. He returned to work with a renewed sense of focus, not obsessive, not self-destructive, but deliberate. He connected with clients, attended meetings, and completed projects with satisfaction, not as a distraction, but as a reminder that he was capable and competent on his own terms. He also explored personal passions he had abandoned over the years. He picked up his guitar again, strumming chords into the quiet nights. He walked through the neighborhood, noticing details he had missed in his years of routine. He reconnected with old friends, sharing meals, laughter, and the unspoken understanding of mutual support. Each small act became a brick in the foundation of his rebuilt life. David confronted the apartment one night, alone. He walked through the rooms, touched the surfaces, and felt the echo of what had been lost. But instead of grief, he felt resolve. The past was a teacher, not a jailer. The betrayal, while painful, had illuminated weaknesses in both his marriage and himself, flaws that, if left unexamined, could have consumed him silently for years. He began setting boundaries with Vanessa, confirming that she had left, that their relationship had ended, that his life would no longer orbit around someone who had chosen another. There was no anger in the confrontation this time, only clarity. He had witnessed betrayal, acknowledged it, and refused to allow it to define him. Months passed. The sting of Vanessa's choices dulled, replaced by a quiet strength. David's apartment no longer felt like a reminder of heartbreak, but a space of autonomy. He decorated, organized, and lived intentionally. He met new people, built friendships, and slowly opened his heart to connection again, but on terms that prioritized honesty, respect, and mutual care. Work flourished, too, not as a means of escape, but as a source of pride. His projects succeeded, clients praised him, and opportunities arose that he had never considered before. With each success, he felt a quiet affirmation: life continues even after betrayal, and sometimes stronger than before. One evening, David sat on his balcony with a glass of whiskey, watching the city lights shimmer like distant stars. He thought of Vanessa, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Their marriage had been real once, even if it had ended in heartbreak. They had shared moments of love and laughter, and now those memories were lessons, not chains. He raised his glass silently, a toast to survival, to self-respect, and to the future he would craft on his own terms. He understood that betrayal had revealed his vulnerabilities, but it had also revealed his strength. And strength, he realized, was the only foundation worth building a life upon. David's life was no longer defined by loss or by the actions of someone else. It was defined by his choices, his integrity, and his willingness to face pain without surrendering to it. The betrayal had broken a chapter, yes, but it had opened the door to a new story, one he would write with care, courage, and a heart unburdened by illusions. He smiled faintly, inhaling the cool night air. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in months, he felt ready. He had lost, yes, but he had also gained something far more valuable: himself. And with that, David finally let the weight lift from his chest, leaving space for the life he deserved. A.